Hello everybody! Today we have a special treat for you. You know, we always talk about diversification. How can we make sure that we don't have all our assets in one basket? Now, we do this by looking at places in the Midwest or in the Southeast or in the South to have multiple locations to invest. But now imagine if you were investing on a global scale. So that's where the wandering investor comes in, and we have this special guest who has been investing and traveling around the globe on our show today. So I hope you're really curious to find out how do you invest every place across the world. Welcome to the Ideal Investor Show for another episode, and we have an exceptional guest today, a wandering investor named Ladislas. So welcome, Ladislas, to the Ideal Investor Show.
Thank you, Axel.
Yeah, how are you doing today?
Good.
All right, very cool. Well, so I'm sure when people either got the teaser about what we're going to do today or our conversation coming up, they were wondering, what is a wandering investor and how do you become that? So can you give us a little bit of a background on your journey, not just for wandering investor, but maybe before you started wandering?
Sure. So a bit of background, bachelor's of business in Canada, then went to business and law school in Australia, immediately went into corporate, started working for Nestle, the big food company at their headquarters in Switzerland. And I was then expatriated for most of my 20s, actually, to Africa. So I lived in South Africa for a while. I lived in Ghana. So I traveled all over the African continent. And my last role there was being in charge of the dairy business for Nestle for a few West African countries. And so when I turned 30, I decided that, I felt like I had done a lot of corporate during my 20s and I wanted to try something new. So initially, before moving on to a next corporate challenge somewhere else, I went on a big road trip with my parents, actually. So we drove from Oman to Paris by car. Through all of Iran. Yeah, beautiful road trip. Amazing. So we got a big Toyota. And then we drove through all of Iran, through Armenia, through Nagorno-Karabakh, Georgia, all of Turkey, and then Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, Ukraine, and then off to Paris. So it was really...
Did you have like a tent or something on it? Or how did you spend the night?
No, we just stayed in like cheap hotels.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah, because in all of these countries, you can typically get an Airbnb or a hotel for, I don't know, for $30 a night.
So, yeah. Right. Yeah.
It just wasn't really worth it. So along the way, I saw all these opportunities because the reality is when you work full time, you don't have enough time to manage your own personal finances. And typically you'll spend, I don't know, maybe 2-3 hours a week managing your personal finances, but that's objectively not enough if you want to optimize your investments.
Right.
And being in these countries and spending time and not having to think about my P&L, how my P&L will look at the end of the month that I'd have to send to my boss, I was able to see the opportunities. And so gradually I started getting into real estate deals in the region. I started buying real estate, started doing a few flips, a few renovations, and then flipping them, etc. And then as I was doing this, I realized after a few months that I kept delaying, looking for a job. After a while, I just realized that I can do this full time. I can manage my money full time. And
so it actually makes... You weren't missing it anymore?
Yeah. And then it was pretty funny because then my friends were seeing pictures of me on Facebook.
Yeah.
And they're like, Ladislas, like you're in all these weird countries.
Yeah.
And you don't seem to have a job. Like, what do you do? And then I started blogging about, I just started a simple website, thewanderinginvestor.com. And I started initially just writing about, the investment opportunities that I saw. I started analyzing markets as well, housing markets, just to help me in my own thought process. When you put your thesis down on paper, it helps you be more critical because it's out there in the open.
Right.
So
you ask questions and stuff. Yeah.
So now I've been doing this for 5 years. I travel around full time. Mm-hmm. And I manage my investments, my money, and I do a lot of real estate. So not only real estate, but stocks, obviously, as well, and private placements, et cetera, but a lot of real estate and mostly real estate in emerging and frontier markets.
Okay, yeah, that's very cool. Before we dive a little deeper into that, which I'm sure the audience is very interested, you said you got your bachelor's degree in Canada and then graduate work in, I think you said Australia.
Correct.
I mean, in a sense, you said when we first started, like it's when we talked before the official recording started, that the name comes originally from Poland, but you are French.
Correct.
So I know that there's a French speaking part in the Montreal area in Canada and stuff like that. But was that just a desire to do your academic work in Canada and then in another even further away country, or how did that come together?
Cool. I mean, if you want to discuss academics, let's do it.
So no, I'm just saying, how did you end up in different countries cool. That early on, right? Like, it sounds like out of high school and then onto the travel.
Because back then there was a special treaty between France and Quebec, and it meant that as a French citizen, I could study in Quebec, whether Anglophone or Francophone universities, and pay Quebec tuition fees. So I got to study in North America in English for $2,500 Canadian a year. That explains Canada.
Oh, absolutely. And then you said, well, let me try a different accent.
And then, then I wanted to, exactly, I wanted another accent. So I went to Australia simply because the University of Sydney had a very interesting program, which was a master's degree that mixed business and law. And it was not just business law, it was like real law at the law school, etc. So I thought that was an interesting program, so I went for it.
Right. And what would you say besides then, you said going corporate, working with Nestle, which, if I'm not mistaken, is actually the largest kind of food company in the world.
Yeah.
So I understand that journey to going corporate and finding a job, and obviously having that already on your resume before you really even get into the normal work life is probably helpful, multi-language and all that kind of stuff. But what would you say were some of the influences that allowed you, for example, to be successful at Nestle, especially in Africa?
That's a good question. I think being able to adapt yourself, because things are very different in Africa. And between all of these African countries, things are also very different.
Right.
And what you need to be able to make it in Africa, so not only the whole cultural awareness, obviously, but that goes for anywhere, the ambiguity tolerance. So you need to be able to deal with ambiguity. You need to be able to manage risk, and you need to be able to manage to work and operate in markets that are data poor. Because in Western countries, we have a lot of data. We have too much data. So for example, in real estate in the US, you have a fantastic tool that you don't really find anywhere else in the world, including in Germany. So the MLS, where you have this database with everything, like each house has a whole history of owners and prices and property taxes. And, you click on a few things and you have all these fancy reports that calculate the yields and everything. When you're in most markets in the world, there is none of this. You have to make your own market analysis. You have to speak to people. You have to use your gut a lot more. You have to trust your gut a lot more. So very different.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's very cool. And I mean, when I read a little bit about you, one of the things that stuck out to me is that, at least it sounded to me, and please say if I got that right or not, but it sounded to me that for doing this without having something like the MLS or a very strong analytical access point of some kind, that this gut feeling that you just mentioned, or it seems more like to have that strong conviction that it's the right thing, comes from spending time, not just as a visit for a few days or maybe a couple of weeks like a normal tourist would, but spending some real time with real people in their real environment, in their real economy, in their real struggles and tribulations and successes and stuff like that. To, I guess my interpretation would be to really figure out how the place ticks, how it works, what can be depended on and whatnot. Is that a fair summary?
100%. And even more so for real estate, because everyone in the world has a strong opinion of their local real estate market.
Right.
So it's very easy to get people to talk about real estate. You can even talk when you're, going around, talk to anyone, ask them how much rent they're paying, and etc. And people will talk. In most cultures, people will talk, especially if you pay them a beer.
Yeah, or something else that similar effects, I guess. Yeah. So before we go a little further and deeper into the real estate part, which people are probably waiting for and getting annoyed that I keep asking you other stuff. But one thing that I found to be really important, and over the years, I would almost go as far as saying it has gotten more important, both in the mentoring that we provide, in the engagement that we have with people, and that is mindset. And you said, dealing with ambiguity and things like that. Could you dive a little deeper on what kind of a mindset it takes to be like an international investor?
So you need to accept risk. And part of ambiguity tolerance is accepting that you'll be wrong a lot of the times and that it's okay to change your mind. Because some of the mistakes I made in the past in my investments was just creating this thesis in my head and then going on the ground and seeing orange flags, but choosing to ignore them because they didn't quite fit my thesis. And I still thought I had a good thesis. But it's important to take a step back at times, even if you've already invested a little bit of money, you've invested time, et cetera, to just take a step back and say, cool, I've already spent this amount of time, this amount of money, but the rest of the money that I'm willing to allocate, actually, is there a better place for my capital?
Right.
It's not because I already spent 3% of what I wanted to spend that I need to commit the other 97%. But often we get emotionally attached to having started the process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we have some clients who initially stayed, mentoring clients who want to get to what we call the time freedom point by going down what we call the ideal investor journey and develop a passive income portfolio. And they initially stayed that they have a very strong desire and motivation to reach that time freedom point sooner rather than later, which then automatically, after we worked a little bit on the concept, or as you call it, the thesis, means you would have to have that flexibility. I don't know if it's ambiguity, it's more a flexibility and willingness to say, I'm focusing on these well-performing or the high-performing properties. And we hopefully will dive a little further into, what is a good balance. You mentioned the word risk. There's things like quality, there are occupancy rates and ratios and all that kind of stuff. But fundamentally to say, okay, well, there are certain kinds of property that have a propensity to perform better, but they might not be the prettiest in the A-class neighborhood, in the most desirable location, and so forth and so forth. And it becomes a balancing act between the quality, the level of renovation, the economic environment, and so forth. And I'm only talking about the North American market, but I would assume fundamentally that applies other places too. At least it did in Germany, as long as I lived there. And when this conviction, this initially stated conviction, I want to get to my time freedom point quickly, and therefore I want to focus on cash flow, is then becoming real in the sense of, okay, here are properties that would actually fulfill this versus other properties that are prettier, that you might even consider being able to live in or could see yourself live in, stuff like that, but they don't perform nearly the same way, right? So that is one of the things. So what I wanted to ask you is if you could, because you also mentioned, sometimes you see something that you really like and it doesn't perform, and then you see something that you might not like on first glance, even after some research, but then you go to the analysis and say, well, but all the evidence is here to say this would be a good investment. You mentioned earlier errors or failures. Could you give us a little bit, like maybe 2 short stories, one where is a good example for what looked to be good and turned out to be a mistake, and something where you would say never expected it, but it came out great?
Yeah, so you're completely right with often the properties that people prefer for themselves are not going to be the best performers. As soon as you add emotion to an investment, and you, especially in real estate, you prefer the place, those are typically going to be suboptimal, which is why when people go, I have a lot of clients, they'll get to me and they'll say, oh, I want a house in Europe that gives me residency rights and that I can rent out and get a good yield and like that I still get to use in the summer. And it's like, look, you're trying to shoot way too many birds with this one bullet. So we can get a bunch of stuff, but you're not going to get the high yields. Like you'll get your residency, you'll have a nice place in Europe for the summer, and you'll cover your expenses and even a bit more, but you're not going to get a better deal. You're not going to get better cash flow than if you buy in some small town in the Midwest. That's not going to happen.
Right. Yeah. So do you have actually like a deal or two that you could give us as an example,
Sure.
stuck in your memory and you can tell the
Yeah.
story?
So one deal is when I bought a property in Oman in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
I did it when I was still working full time. So I just honestly, I didn't dedicate enough due diligence to it. So I bought an apartment there in 2015 or so, 2014, at the peak of oil prices. So the yields were good.
Kind
The
of same
property
like
was very
today,
nice.
oil prices.
Yeah, even higher back then. And then what happened is the oil went into a 5-6 year bear market,
Right.
which meant that it turns out, and I wasn't that informed back then, that when you buy real estate in Gulf countries, it's actually a synthetic of the oil price with just a bit of less leverage. So the property went down in price just gradually, and as well as the rental income. So not only was the property going down, but also every year my rent would actually decrease. When I saw that there was potential for oil prices to go back up, instead of just sitting there and saying, oh, the price of oil is going to go back up, so I'll be able to, if I wait a few years, get my property back to where it was and then sell it, which would have been emotionally attached to a number that is actually completely meaningless. I sold my property, I took a hit, and then I put that money into oil equities instead, because they provide a lot more leverage to the price of oil. Price of oil went back up. I more than made my money back, even compared to the initial investment. It's just a great decision. But essentially, I had to make that decision to sell at the bottom because there was a better way to play oil than that apartment.
Would you consider that a success story or more a failure story?
The initial purchase was a complete failure, but then being able to sell at the bottom, but in a non-emotional way, and being very clear with what I would do with that money and having a strategy, that was a success. Because it's easy to say, like, get rid of the dogs in your portfolio and find new winners. Don't just keep dogs because, you're emotionally attached to them. But saying it and actually going through the process and crystallizing a large loss on a property is always hard.
Yeah. And I mean, if you want to really stick with that analogy, then you basically went from dogs to something like, I don't know, cats maybe, or cows, or it's not really even the same category of animal when you go to oil derivatives or oil stocks or anything like that, right? So just for those who are not that familiar, and I know that in North America at least some people struggle with it. So when Ladislas said Oman, so just for orientation, it's on the Arabian Peninsula, kind of bordering on Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and the Arabian Sea. So kind of anybody who wants to pull out a map and say, where the heck is Oman? Because it's not that often in the news. One quick thing, is Oman oil only, or do they also have gas?
Both, right? But it's pretty much all they do, just oil and gas.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a pretty desert-like country. I hope for you that your apartment was at least by the beach or something.
It was a very nice apartment.
Okay. So I'm not sure that I really know what category, but since I asked you one that didn't work so well and one that worked well, did you combine it, or is there a real success story that you'd like to share?
Yeah. So Montenegro, so in the Balkans, I went there on vacation with a friend. And I was there and I thought, oh, wow, it's beautiful little country. It's south of Croatia. It's a little country of 600,000 people. South of Croatia, real estate is maybe 60% the price of Croatia, but there is a lot less regulation, a lot less taxes. And the scene is a lot more international. So you have buyers from Europe, from the US, from the Middle East, from all over the Balkans, a lot of Russians as well. So very dynamic market for such a small country. And so I went there in winter for a few months actually, and was just like spending my time there. Beautiful place. There's the sea and there's also skiing. And I was just going around looking for a deal, just because it's a low liquidity market. Yeah. And in low liquidity markets, so complete opposite of the US, essentially you're the buyer, so you have the power. So if you're there with cash, you go around, you take your time, you just wait for the kill. And I met this developer. He was well known in the community. And then, he showed me some of his projects. And then I asked him if he had anything else. And then he mentioned, he was like, oh, he jumped in his car. And then he showed me this piece of land. He was like, yeah, we're going to buy this piece of land. We're going to do this project. And he showed me on his phone. He had a project.
Yeah.
I was like, okay, cool. So you have the building permit, or how does it work? Because you already have the project in your phone, but you said you didn't buy the land yet. He's like, yeah, we're in the process of buying it. And I'm like, what about the permit? It's like, oh yeah, we don't have it yet, but it'll be fine. So I knew from being around there for a few months that he had a good reputation. And when you invest in small markets, in small countries, essentially reputation is key more than the contract that you sign.
Everybody knows everyone.
Yeah, because if you're going to screw over someone, you're going to screw over one person, and then you're done in that country. Like in your own home country, you're finished. Everyone will know you screwed people over. So I cut a deal with them there. And I agreed to buy a bunch of studios from him. I even called a few friends that I know tolerate risk. So all based in Africa, obviously. Yeah. And essentially, we signed a contract and paid 30% upfront for the apartments. And the guy didn't have any permits, nothing. So I had a lawyer go through the contract, and he said, Ladislas, like, you do realize that this contract doesn't really mean anything. I was like, I know, like, let's go for it. And yeah, it turned out to be a great investment, like fantastic operation.
And when you say great investment, can you quantify that a little bit on what does that mean for you and your friends in numbers?
So 30% upfront, 40% midway, 30% at the key. And then it took about 1 year to sell the properties. Everything was built in 2 years. So in 3 years, we made about 70 to 80%.
What kind of numbers in a place like that are we looking at? I mean, if you were to describe what is a studio in size and location, and then how much do you pay and stuff like that?
Look, taking a step back, I'm going to be talking in square meters. So you're going to have to translate that into square feet. Okay.
You can do the times 3 plus 10% really quick.
Okay, cool. So typically in that market, you would be selling real estate approximately fourth, fifth line behind the sea for 2,000 euros a square meter.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We bought them for about 13.50 per square meter.
Okay.
And then paid them gradually. So there was inherently a bit of leverage in the payment plan, and then flipped them for between 2,200 and 2,300 euros a square meter, because they were better than average. They were fully furnished, and they had a pool, which most of the other buildings around didn't have. Yeah.
So just for those of you who are not that familiar with metric system, that's a little bit more than $100, about $120 per square foot initially, instead of paying more closer to like 180. And then on the sale, if I'm understanding it right, you sold probably in the area of about 250 or so dollars per square foot, maybe 210 to 250, but compared almost double what you initially put in. Is that about right?
Yeah.
Okay. And so how much does the studio in Montenegro go for?
Depending on the sizes, you have tiny ones of like 17 square meters. You have bigger ones of like 30 square meters.
Okay. Yeah. So that's about 400 square foot. Like the bigger one, how much would they go for?
The bigger one was going for about 75,000 euros approximately.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah. And the euro and the dollar is nowadays pretty close. It's probably like 80,000, something like that. Yeah. Now, the thing is, one thing that I'm always harping on a lot with our mentoring clients, and when I'm writing on Bigger Pockets and places like that, is performance, also in the context of how can you use only a little of your own money and get other people to put in their money. So in these international investments, not necessarily so specifically on a particular market, but can anybody buy with leverage, meaning with lending, or is everything cash?
It's mostly cash. The reality is, if you want to use leverage, if you want high returns, if you want a dynamic market, honestly, it's hard to beat North America. As soon as you go into emerging markets, forget leverage. No one's going to give you leverage, especially as a US person, because banks don't like dealing with Americans because of American regulations. Yeah. So they're cash markets. So your best bet at obtaining leverage is by buying from developers and agreeing on a payment plan. So for example, in Egypt, you can buy off-plan developments with 10-year payment plans. So that would be a way to obtain leverage. But overall, I see these emerging markets more for, so looking at your market, US people, Canadians, etc., as a way to diversify and internationalize. So it's not necessarily about obtaining superior returns, but it's about having money outside of the country in a different jurisdiction that is farther away from people that want to sue you. It's a jurisdiction diversification play. And also in some cases, some of these properties can give you residency rights. So for example, in Montenegro, if you own real estate there, you are entitled, you and your family, to residency in Montenegro. So if you ever needed to leave for whatever reason or wanted to live in Europe, then you can just go and live in Montenegro and you get your residency card and you can live there. Other countries, in Turkey, for example, if you buy for $250,000 of real estate, and I have a lot of American clients that are doing this these days, and Canadians, because of everything that happened recently, they are buying Turkish real estate for about $250,000. They can do it entirely remotely, though I encourage people to go there, to go visit Istanbul, amazing city.
Yeah.
And then 9 months later, they get a Turkish passport for themselves, their spouse, and their children below the ages of 18. So it's a fantastic way to obtain a second citizenship, which is a hedge these days, really.
Right. Okay. And can you differentiate it a little bit? I mean, there is like the EU, like a 27, maybe soon 28 country bloc basically, versus, like you mentioned, Egypt. And I know Turkey has been trying to, well, I don't know if Erdogan still wants to become part of the EU or not, but at least for a while, Turkey tried pretty desperately to become part of the EU. And then you mentioned some places that are definitely outside. So can you give a little bit for those who are not that familiar with, I think I'm asking it also because when I mention this, because people ask me as I still have my EU citizenship, and so I can basically do anything and wouldn't necessarily run into these kind of country related, oh, you're coming from the US, because that triggers issues. But fundamentally, I know that a lot of people who are intrigued, and that's part of the reason why we have conversations like we have with you today, Ladislas, is they also have concerns about not so much their personal security, but the security of their investment. Legal recourse, you said in Montenegro, I had a contract and my lawyer said, well, you realize it's basically not enforceable. How would you react to somebody saying, yeah, I think it's cool and it's a nice property, but do I have any recourse? Do I have any legal standing? What would happen if something goes wrong or somebody is doing something wrong and I want to basically, as the owner, get my right, so to speak?
Yeah, look, honestly, generally, it's not much of an issue. In the European Union, definitely not an issue. Your rights as a property owner are strong. As a landlord, potentially less so, because governments love to tax landlords. But that's a different topic. But I've done deals like even in Africa a few years after like a civil war in some countries. I bought real estate. At the end of the day, look, this example I gave was not best practice. Okay, it was just things that happen in these countries, but it's certainly not something I would recommend. Right. So the way you typically do deals and the way I've done my other deals in Montenegro is, because you wanted to know a story that went surprisingly well.
Yeah, exactly.
Typically, you hire a good lawyer. Mm-hmm. You do not cheap out on the lawyer, even if locals tell you, oh, you paid how much for this lawyer? Oh, I know a lawyer that can do it cheaper. You can always find a lawyer that can do it cheaper. Just get a good lawyer. The best way is simply to go to local embassies in the country where you're looking at real estate and look at the law firms that they listed. You can go to the US embassy. They typically have a list. The German embassy sometimes has a list as well. And you just contact these lawyers, you get a quote, and you work through one of these law firms. You'll pay more, but that's fine. And then the whole process will not be an issue whatsoever. So it's just about not cutting corners. I spent time in Colombia. You hear of all these like Americans and they buy land and then they get played and this and that. But when you actually inquire, they just sign like some piece of paper with some guy somewhere in some office. And, they didn't follow the process. They didn't hire a lawyer. They didn't go to the notary public. People just land in some country and just do clownish things. But if you follow the process, I'd say in 99% of cases, it's not an issue whatsoever. Good. The issue is rather overpaying because you don't know the market.
Right,
That's
absolutely.
your bigger risk.
Yeah, understood. Yeah, and I think language could be an issue in some cases as well. If you have
Yep.
a hard time expressing yourself and everything has to be translated and you don't really know, there are layers, I'm sure, and you're the expert on identifying all of those. Now, if somebody were to say, okay, well, this all sounds really kind of intriguing, and you mentioned, like, I don't know, they didn't call it martial law, they called it emergency laws, but in a way it was a form of martial law that just happened in Canada. We have war in Russia and Ukraine. We have sometimes crazy politicians as presidents in over here. So I mean the ball that we're all living on obviously has gotten more volatile, if or whatever other word we want to apply to that. So I can totally see that people say, a little bit of diversification, not so much from a performance perspective, but for having alternatives. Can you give us a little bit of an idea for our audience? I mean, yes, we will have all the links and how they can get in touch with you and so forth, but how would somebody have to imagine what would be a starting point? Like, besides just getting in touch, what would they have to do? What would they have to have? What would they have to bring to the table?
People need to be clear in terms of their objectives.
Okay.
I think that's the number one thing, because sometimes people get in touch with me, Ladislas, I'd like a consulting session. I want to do this, that, but there's no overarching objective. Like, what's really your objective? Do you really want that second passport? Do you really want the second residency? Are you looking for a holiday home, or do you want good numbers? Because those typically don't go well together. Like, what do you want? And then just be clear in your objectives in life, and how much are you able to budget ultimately for this additional security and diversification.
And is there like a spectrum of, since you said it's pretty much all cash, and then there's probably fees for the lawyer and fees for other stuff and so forth, where you would say, okay, if you consider something like that in a reasonably safe place or a stable place, any kind of starting number where if it's not at least that, I wouldn't necessarily suggest to start or consider it.
Yeah, I mean, look, at least $100,000 you need to be willing to put somewhere. I mean, you can get cheap apartments and you can get a studio in Montenegro for $50,000. That could work. But generally, if you want to have a bit of play money, at least $100,000.
Okay, well, I think that's very good to know, especially since we already established that it's kind of like a cash kind of thing with fees and lawyers and documents and all that.
But having said this, if you want to make your money sweat and work, you would be the person to talk to. I'm more the person to talk to when it comes to, diversifying and all of that. But when it comes to using leverage, getting great numbers, totally. etc., it's in your markets.
Yeah,
it's
I think you just gave me a compliment that I didn't invite the competition. Did I get that right? Okay, cool. Well, Ladislav, that is wonderful. And I think it's really enlightening, because I believe there are more people than might want to admit, or the media want to let us believe, who are actually having those thoughts. Where is all this going? What is this kind of unusual? Because I think I would say this, at least for myself, we have a certain arc of history that we can look at, right? Like, I mean, I can relate to what my parents and grandparents told me, especially grandparents who lived through World War II and came from all kind of places and ended up in where I was born. And then my parents and my own experience and what I can relate to my daughter. And naturally, there are other people that are kind of associated that way. But World War II was over. And I didn't go to Korea and stuff, even though I was an Air Force officer. So same thing, like people told me about the 1929 market crash in the United States, and that people were lining up for food and money and ran on the banks and all that kind of stuff. It's one thing that you read in a history book, but when you see certain things happening basically while you're in your full consciousness, I would say, it's a different ballgame, and we don't often have necessarily something to refer to. So I can see that people feel this kind of, okay, this daily life is kind of like a routine that is only very rarely have any significant changes. And then you see in the news, especially since we have so much access to information these days, all these things that you only knew from your history books or from some kind of far away places that couldn't affect you, and then like suddenly oil is $105 today for a barrel, right? Like, so people will see that on the gas pump pretty quickly. All right, cool. That was just something, maybe I needed to say this for some reason. Anyways, I want to ask you two final questions that we ask everybody. The first one is, if you could meet anybody, and I mean, you're a super well-traveled person in the world, anybody that you would have suddenly magically access to, and it could even be somebody that is maybe not around anymore, Who would that be and why?
I think the Russian writer Solzhenitsyn would be a fantastic person to talk to. And he'd really give insight into how to survive in tyrannical political systems and how to mentally go through them and survive them, not just physically, but mentally.
Right. Yeah, I was fascinated too about his writings about the Gulag. I remember that from Europe. I don't know that that's very familiar here in the US, but yeah, that's an interesting one. It kind of in a similar way to Mandela, right? Keep your faith and your beliefs in light of what was going on and what they did to him, similar thing. So yeah, very cool. Okay, cool. And then the other question is, if you had a time machine, you can go forward, backwards, up and down. Where would you go and why?
I think I would choose to go back a very long time.
Okay.
Yeah, around the times of Jesus Christ and the Roman Empire and all of that. I think that would be fascinating.
Okay. See, I was just about to ask you, Ladislas, what is a very long time? Because I think 1 or 2 shows ago, a guest said the same thing. And I said, okay, where do you go? And he said, I want to see the dinosaurs.
Nice.
So very long time can be different things. Yeah. So by the way, you're not the first person who says that. There's actually a movie, you can watch it on YouTube, a little clip about how Moses got the 10 commandments. Did you know it was originally 15?
Oh, really?
No, it wasn't. It's just
okay.
a little movie clip. They made a little movie clip. So he goes up the mountain and by the bush and stuff like that. And then God gives him 3 plates with 5 commandments on each. And he's trying to walk down the mountain with 3. And then in the little clip, 1 falls down. And so, okay. So it's just 10 then. So yeah, if you Google that or go on YouTube and you have a little fun with that. All right, cool. Well, that's very good. So with that question also answered, tell us, for anybody who wants to get in touch with you, Ladislas, how do they do that the best way, the easiest way? If they say, I think he's right, I want to diversify, I want to get residency or some other place I could go if the brown stuff hits the fan.
Cool, sure. So go to my website, thewanderinginvestor.com. There's a contact form. And then there's also a private list. So it's free. It's a mailing list. You sign up to it, and then you'll get updates as I travel around the world and look at investments and residency and citizenship opportunities. And then I'm also on YouTube, The Wandering Investor, and Instagram.
Yeah, wonderful. Awesome. And this show and this recording is going to be there too for anybody who rather wants to see it on Ladislas page. So thank you so much, Ladislas, to come to the show, to be here, to spend time with us and explain a little bit what you do and how you do it and how can people participate with it.
My pleasure. Thank you, Axel.
Right. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Ideal Investor Show. More info and the links we mentioned during the show are in the show notes, or you can go to our website at idealwealthgrower.com and sign up for the Apple Podcast link. And if you like to talk to me, sign up for a strategy call. Hopefully you want to share what you learned with your network and bring more people in. We are really eager to hear your comments. And until next time, be well, stay safe, and ciao.